Hey guys, it's Connor. You're watching the JavaScript Mastery series. In this video, we are going to be taking a deep dive into numbers. We're just going to be learning everything that we need to about numbers in JavaScript to make sure that we have our fundamentals covered so that we can get that blue belt in JavaScript. So we're just going to look at the different types of numbers in JavaScript. Then we'll cover some basic arithmetics, then go on to looking at how we can perform some more advanced mathematical calculations and how we can utilize something called the math objects. Then we're going to look at some common pitfalls that developers fall into when it comes to working with numbers and some best practices around the special types nan and infinity. Then we will wrap things up by looking at big numbers in JavaScript and the type. I say it's not really a new type, it's been around since ES6. We're going to look at the BigInt type, how to use it and why. So let's get started. So we've got lots of different types of numbers we've got lots of different kind of numbers in JavaScript. We've got whole numbers, we've got negative numbers, floating point, decimal numbers, we got big numbers. Now the important thing to note is that negative, whole, floating point, decimal numbers, these, even though they're different kind of numbers, they all fall under the same type in JavaScript. When you use the type of operator on all of those different types of numbers, it just returns number. In fact, up until ES6, JavaScript only had the one type, number. Now, when we are working with numbers in JavaScript, there is a limitation to what numbers we can use. There's a maximum number and a minimum number. Now, I'm not going to attempt to verbally say those out loud because the numbers are huge and I'll probably mess it up. But important thing to note is that there is a cap on what numbers we can use. Now, when we run into this cap, we need to use something called big numbers in JavaScript to work around this. And this is supported with the BigInt type that was introduced in ES6 for working with big numbers. So in JavaScript, we can do basic mathematical operations, right? And I'm sure you've probably seen these before. So we can add numbers together, we can take away numbers, we can multiply numbers, we can divide numbers, get division of numbers, so on, so on, so on. No point going over all of these and expecting you to memorize them. These are something that you're going to pick up in your own time as you gain experience and code. Now, there's a few shorthand for mathematical calculations that are worth noting. So for common operations such as incremented numbers, so maybe a equals 50 and you have some kind of loop and you want to add a value onto it incrementally, you could do something like this. For this, there's a shorthand. You can just do a plus equals 50. Like that. Then if I was a constant, if we used to log out a, you got 100 right, actually plus equaled 50. If you're only adding the one value, you can just use the plus plus as such to get to 101. And the same thing works in reverse. So maybe instead of plus equaling 50, you might want to take away 30. This is going to do the same thing, but take away that value, and then we can decrement it by 1 as well. So you see I got 20, 50 take away 30, and then I take away, and then I decrement one for 19. So calculations in JavaScript don't really get much more complicated than this. What I would say though is if you begin to perform more calculations in one go, so maybe you're adding numbers together, then you need to multiply, and then it's getting divided and taking away value. You just want to make sure that you're getting your parentheses correct so that those calculations are being performed in the correct order. So maybe you want to add those 200s together till you come up to 200 before timesing it by 60 and then dividing it by these values taken away. Just something to be aware of. Using those parentheses to group your calculations to make sure you're getting the correct outcome. Now, moving on to more advanced calculations. One thing that you really want to get to know, and you want to get to know well, is the math object. So JavaScript has a powerful math library for performing numeric operations available in the math object. So look here, we've got this math.abs for returning the absolute value. So maybe you have a -20 value or something could return 20. You always want to make sure you get an absolute value. We can round to the nearest integer, down to the nearest integer. We can return the largest number in array, the smallest number in array. We can use power, square, right? You get the picture, right? We're not going to try and memorize all of these in one go. The idea of this segment is you're trying to do something more advanced in JavaScript in terms of a numeric operation. You want to explore the math.object to see what tools you have available to you, to see if there's already a solution at hand that you can use. If you're going into a job interview and you have 20 minutes to complete a challenge, you don't want to spend 20 minutes on trying to solve something that already exists and is already available to you. So make sure you're aware that the math object exists, explore it, and just know that it's there and that you can utilize it. Now, one issue that people run into when performing mathematical calculations is JavaScript, is when we try to perform a mathematical operation on something that produces an invalid number, or we try to perform a numeric operation on, say, something that isn't a number, like a string or a boolean. You see, in JavaScript, when this happens, we don't actually get thrown an error to make us aware of this. Instead, JavaScript silently fails and just produces a special value called, or special type called nan, which literally means not a number. So it's important to be aware of this, because this is what is going to happen when something hasn't gone as expected. So maybe I have let a equals I am a string, and let b equals the number 10, and then for some reason we had an operation where these might get multiplied together. As you can see, we are left with this value nan. We've attempted to perform a mathematical calculation on an invalid type. However, it doesn't produce a number, and this could lead to an issue that we need to be aware of. So you might be thinking, oh well, maybe if we had a result c equals a times b, then we could just look at the type. So if I do type of c, now as you can see, even though this has produced an invalid value, the type is still saying it's a number, because the type of nan is a number in JavaScript, which we don't want. So a workaround for this is to make use of the globally available is nan method. So now there you have it, c is not a number. So you want to be aware that when operations go wrong in JavaScript, the value nan is produced, and we can't just rely on the type of operator to see if we have indeed produced an invalid number. We need to make use of the globally available is nan. This is also available on the number object, but the is nan is just shorter to write. You could also do this kind of check at the beginning of the operation. You know, maybe you had a function and it's going to multiply these together. Maybe somewhere here, you know, you want to make sure that these values are indeed numbers. So if either one of these returns false when checking for it's a number, it can return here. So that's the first pitfall. Numbers, operations that fail in JavaScript produce the value nan, and we can't rely on the type of operator to check for the value, and this is why. So if I had this nan here, nan is equal to nan, as you can see, it doesn't. JavaScript has this weird quirk where when we compare nan to the type nan, doesn't work. So again guys, we need to be familiar with the is nan method for being able to check the results an operation or checking values are indeed numbers before trying to use them for numeric operations. The other special value that we want to look out for when dealing with numbers is infinity. Now you might see this if we do something like this, or we have the -1 number, infinity and minus infinity. When JavaScript is dealing with very large numbers that exceed the range of supported numbers that it has by default, it produces the value infinity. Now another way we could produce this is we could get, let's just look at number.max value. As you can see, we've got this max value here, and now look what happens when I try to multiply this number by 2. Like with infinity, we've just produced a number so large JavaScript doesn't support it. It sits outside of its supported range. So the technical term for this when producing these large numbers is overflow, right? We've produced overflow when we've exceeded JavaScript supported numbers, and it leads to this infinity and minus infinity. So how do we work around this issue, and how do we then work with large numbers in JavaScript? So in ES6, JavaScript introduced a new type that we can use for working with really large numbers that exceed that supported range. And this new type is called BigInt. So we can create a BigInt by prefixing numbers with n. Now if I was to look at the type of big number, as you can see, it is a big integer. Another way of producing big numbers is by using the BigInt function. So let's do that. There we go, a big integer. Now it's important to note that when we're doing arithmetics with BigInt, we can only use these big numbers with other big numbers. We can't just use a big number with a regular number. So for example, I'm not going to be able to just say big number 2 plus 20, right? It's going to say, look, you cannot mix big int and other types, use explicit conversions. Whereas if I use with big number, we can produce a very large number. So that is one of the limitations of working with BigInt. You can't just use these with anything that you like. You need to use another big integer. It's also worth noting that using these big numbers are a lot slower than just using regular numbers in JavaScript. So don't just think you can use big numbers for everything. You want to use them sparingly and absolutely only where you're actually supposed to be using them. And they're also not compatible with all of those methods that we covered in math.objects, right? The second thing worth mentioning with large numbers, let's just say we had a massive large number. It's like 100 million. That it can be quite tricky to read. But one thing that we can do is look at that. A lot of people don't know this, and it's quite a handy trick, but we can indeed use underscores for very large numbers to improve their readability. It just looks a lot easier to read in the code, right? It's a lot clearer that this is a million over the top one, and it's still the exact same values. So that's one handy trick, which is easy to know, but very, very useful and looks super cool. Now, I personally haven't used BigInt in all of my career, so you can be forgiven if you haven't used it either. However, I just think the most important thing is to be aware that it exists and know why that it exists, and being able to demonstrate that you have that awareness. And yeah, you just shows how much JavaScript you really know and how much mastery you have over the language. Even if you haven't used everything, you know what you haven't used and why. So guys, hopefully in this video you've learned all the different types of numbers in JavaScript. You know that there's only two types, number and BigInt. I'm sure you already know those basic arithmetics. We just quickly glanced over those incrementers and decrementers in case you haven't seen those before. And then we went on to look at the math.object. If you already knew that existed, that's great. I just think it's important at this level to be aware that it exists and you know how to utilize it. Last thing you want to do is have a 20-minute whiteboarding coding challenge and spending 15 minutes trying to round or figure out how to do some kind of calculation when you can already utilize the methods that are available to us in JavaScript. Then we looked at some special values, nan, undefined. We looked at why they exist and how they can lead to common pitfalls and how to avoid those, you know, and implement those best coding practices. And then we wrapped things up by looking at how we can utilize the BigInt type that was introduced in ES6 for working with really large numbers. You know, hopefully you know why that exists. Even if you haven't used it before, it's just great to know that it's there. So that's it guys, that's a wrap. If you gained any value from the video, please like it. Also, if you want to make sure that you don't miss the next video in the Blue Belt series, then make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss those.